The musical Hamilton is a truly astonishing piece of art, breathing life into one of America's lesser-known founding fathers. It puts the spotlight on a man who consolidated national power at the expense of the states. Even for history buffs, Alexander Hamilton and the formation of the National Bank isn't the most exciting stuff. Yet Lin-Manuel Miranda and his collaborators managed to tell a compelling story while remaining true to the historical record. Hip-hop became the gimmick, allowing the directors to consciously cast the roles in order to produce a nearly all-black production. A black actor playing Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner who denied his children with Sally Hemings, is itself a powerful commentary on the nation's leading Republican. That they also cast George Washington as a black actor and avoided being immediately canceled by America's far right shows how far America has gone towards anti-woke, anti-DEI policies since the musical's opening in 2015. Interestingly, the largest criticism came from the far left, with the hyper-partisan, unreliable source Counterpunch titling its review article, "Hamilton the Musical, Black Actors Dress Up Like Slave Traders, and It's Not Halloween." History professor Lydia Monteiro gives us a much more nuanced explanation for why she had a difficult time embracing Hamilton the Musical, stating that by cloaking white history in the talent, bodies, and labor of people of color, Hamilton obscures the white supremacist origins of our country. You could argue that the show deserves credit for taking these stories and subverting them through casting that these same white supremacists would find horrifying. The historian finishes stating, "However, I'd argue that we're not yet in a place as a country for this subversion to ultimately be successful." African Americans were largely relegated to the sidelines during the founding of the Republic. If we turned the typical high school history textbook into a musical, the only role that we would find for black men and women would be as a slave. In reality, African Americans, both free and enslaved, played major roles in the creation of our nation. All too often, however, their contributions have been erased, meaning that few students have ever heard of Crispus Attucks, who literally led the protest that resulted in the Boston Massacre. Attucks, a man of mixed African and indigenous American blood, was the first man to die in the American Revolution. Nor do they hear about the 1st Rhode Island Division, a company of brave men who volunteered and fought with bravery against the British in order to gain freedom from their oppressors, both foreign and domestic. Also excluded is York, William Clark's slave, who valiantly took his turn guarding the core of discovery as it traversed the unexplored western half of our nation. The Founding Fathers are integral to American history, but African Americans are equally important. For as Black Minister Richard Allen, a former slave, pointed out, that this land which we have watered with our tears and our blood is now our mother country. Black and Latino audiences may not see themselves in the faces of the Founding Fathers, but they deserve to engage with history in a way that lets them see themselves in the nation's founding ideals. Hamilton isn't a perfect historical production. There are small flaws. For instance, there were 5 Schuyler sisters. But the writer's biggest challenge was how to portray Aaron Burr, the musical's lead villain. Every story needs a villain, and Aaron Burr certainly delivers. He killed Hamilton in the nation's most famous duel, and his own running mate, Thomas Jefferson, later charged him with treason. Still, director Thomas Kail says they didn't see Burr as a villain at all. As he put it, "If you are judged by your worst day, who would any of us be?" Miranda even thought about playing Burr himself after writing several of his songs, including, wait for it, in Burr's actual bedroom. Complexity is what makes Burr such a compelling figure in the nation's founding. As people moved on from Benedict Arnold's treason, they found a new villain in Burr, the fallen founder they themselves created. The widespread popularity of Hamilton has cemented Burr's image as a villain. But look deeper, and he seems less a villain than a man swept up by a tide that erased his legacy. Burr believed he was divinely saved for greater things. In truth, it wasn't an angel that touched him, but a demon that cursed him in a unique way. And while Burr himself escaped the worst of that curse, those around him paid the price for his pursuit of a birthright. Burr lost his parents young and grew up an orphan with his sister. He signed on to fight for America beneath Benedict Arnold, then served under the Revolution's first martyr. For years he waited to be recognized, but his next commission came under a man who had bought his way into command, a man history remembers for incompetence. Burr's fortune sank even further when he backed the wrong side as Hamilton and others sacrificed General Lee to secure Washington's power. That choice put him at odds with the future father of the country. Miranda takes us inside Burr's mind, revealing a man shaped by loss and ambition. His version of Burr confesses in song that death doesn't discriminate between sinners and the saints. It takes and it takes and it takes, and we keep living anyway. And we keep living anyway. We rise and we fall, and we break and we make our mistakes. And if there's a reason I'm still alive when everyone who loves me has died, I'm willing to wait for it. Everything in that verse is accurate, except the ending. After winning his duel with Alexander Hamilton, Burr faced public scorn, jail time, and, for the first time, a dead end in politics. In that moment, Aaron Burr, our nation's fallen founder, broke bad. He was no longer willing to wait for it. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon America's fallen founder, Aaron Burr. Episode number 1, Willing to Wait for It. Aaron Burr was born to be a patriot, destined to shape the world for generations. Or so it seemed. His grandfather was the first in the family to make the history books. Jonathan Edwards, the fire and brimstone preacher, was one of the most influential figures in early American religion. A devout Calvinist, Edwards followed a Protestant sect that embraced predestination, the belief that God had already decided who would be saved. Beyond that, strict Calvinists held that everything that happened was part of God's predetermined master plan. The idea of predestination is inherently un-American, since the nation's founding ideals hold that anyone, no matter their station, no matter their past, can rise through hard work and ingenuity. It's also paradoxical. If everything is already determined, why bother preaching to the masses? Yet religious leaders like Edwards believed that spreading God's message could awaken the elect to his intentions. In their view, these chosen souls had to first believe in God to receive his gifts. Their method, which fueled the first Great Awakening, was shock and awe. Edwards' seminal work, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, painted a vivid, terrifying picture of sin's consequences. warning, the God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. Human sinfulness and the necessity of divine grace were central messages during the First Great Awakening. But Edward stood out by telling his followers that the apocalyptic future described in the book of Revelation would only come after Jesus returned to save the elect. Historian Alan Taylor explains that Edwards believed Christ would only return after believers established 1,000 years of utopian and universal Christianity on earth. To advance the millennium, Protestants promoted missions throughout the country and around the globe. The Calvinist strategy was simple: terrify people into conversion. By creating a visible church on earth, they could start the clock on the apocalypse, bringing salvation to the invisible church, the chosen elect. Edwards believed that God had a plan, though he never claimed to fully understand it himself. So while it's tempting to read the following line from his most famous sermon as a prophecy about his famous grandson, it doesn't actually foreshadow Burr's fate. As Edwards preached, as he that walks in slippery places is liable to fall, he can't foresee one moment whether he shall stand or fall the next. And when he does fall, he falls at once, without warning. That verse could also describe the unexpected fate of Burr's parents, who died when he was just 2 years old. Their only legacy was a steadfast desire for their children to continue their path. Education was central to that goal. Aaron's father had studied at Yale and was serving as Princeton's president when he was called to preach at the funeral of New Jersey's governor, where he unknowingly contracted yellow fever. At the time, this disease was common in colonial America, introduced via water barrels from countries where it was endemic. Once on American soil, mosquitoes spread it, and in 1693, yellow fever killed 10% of Philadelphia's population in a mere few months. Sally, Aaron's older sister by 2 years, managed to avoid the illness, but Aaron himself was said to be on the brink of death. Historian Nancy Eisenberg writes, after her husband's death, Esther's own father, the Reverend Jonathan Edwards, moved to Princeton to replace him as president of the college. Yet he was next, struck down by smallpox in March 1758. Though Esther Burr and her children had all been inoculated, she barely outlasted her father, dying on April 7th. If that was not enough tragedy for one family, Sarah Edwards, Esther's mother, came to Princeton to collect the family belongings and take charge of her grandchildren, when she too became ill with dysentery and died on October 2nd. In little over a year, Aaron Burr had lost both his parents and his grandparents. He and Sally were now orphans. Though too young to remember them, Aaron grew up and later raised his own child in a way that would have made his mother proud. She left behind a massive journal that revealed an emerging feminist voice in the colonies, a woman whom Burr and others considered a genius in her own right. His failed attempt to legally emancipate all slaves echoed his mother's own doubts about the concept of owning another human being, whose soul above all else belonged to God. Journals were common among educated colonialists, yet writings by Aaron Burr himself are extremely rare. It's unclear whether this was due to early signs of his paranoia or because he later scrubbed material that might contradict the story he wanted to tell. As a result, we only have fragments of his childhood. Burr and his sister were first cared for by a family friend for 2 years before being permanently placed with their mother's younger brother, Timothy Edwards. That household already had 5 children, meaning Aaron had to metaphorically fight for his place among older aunts and uncles. Timothy Edwards was a strict disciplinarian who continued his father's fire and brimstone preaching. Yet he was also a devoted guardian, ensuring his wards received an education while switching careers to become a lawyer and provide for a family that eventually grew to 15 children. Seeking to follow in his father's footsteps, Aaron submitted an application to Princeton at the age of 11. Eisenberg explains that colonial colleges were more like today's preparatory schools, and Princeton's student body had young men of all ages. Though he had the proper academic qualifications, the trustees and faculty still rejected him because of his age. He spent the next 2 years studying the college curriculum on his own, and in 1769 reapplied for examination and was admitted as a sophomore. At 13, Burr was still 4 years younger than most of his classmates, and his youth set him apart. His college nickname was Little Burr, affectionately mocking his unusual but annoying curiosity as much as his small stature. Princeton was originally a thriving center for trained New Light ministers who would spread the teachings of the Great Awakening. By the time Aaron Burr arrived on campus, however, the university had broadened its focus, becoming a primary source for Enlightenment thought in the colonies. This might seem contradictory, since the Enlightenment emphasized reason and critical thinking. While its ideas helped justify overthrowing a king who claimed divine right, they did not challenge God himself. Instead, the movement promoted a more rational approach to faith, envisioning a creator who, like a clockmaker, built the world and then stepped aside, only intervening if something went wrong. They say Hamilton wrote like he was running out of time. Aaron Burr? He studied like he was running out of time. Some accounts say he spent 18 hours a day locked in his room, grinding through lessons on contemporary and social affairs. Those long hours left their mark, shaping religious ideas that sometimes flirted with atheism. Yet Burr wasn't angry or bitter about it. He once calmly said the Bible was the most perfect system of truth the world had ever seen. He just wasn't sure it was true. Burr's willingness to think outside the norm society imposed on him didn't stop in his youth. It guided his entire life. He charted his own course, often ignoring the advice of men who had become known as the Founding Fathers. He spoke out against the horrors of slavery, encouraged his daughter to embrace feminism, and participated in political campaigns, even when opponents called it disqualifying. Foreshadowing his political future, Burr joined both of the two political clubs on campus, groups that would later lay the foundation for America's first political parties. He tried to straddle both, even though they were rivals often engaged in public feud and pranks. Acts like this would later earn him a reputation for being unprincipled. The musical Hamilton leaned into that, and research fellow Rhys Jones even called Donald Trump the most unprincipled man in politics, adding, "He is simply Burr incarnate." Historian Sean Wilentz, however, offers a sharper view. Burr's real problem was that he often stood apart, becoming a faction unto himself. After burning bridges on both sides, he was left excluded by the very system he had risked his life to defend. His independent streak even led him to switch majors, from preparing to be a reverend to studying law, just like his uncle. A common assignment at Princeton asked students to write and deliver sermons on topics of their choice. Burr's most famous, titled On Honor, would later serve as his justification for the illegal duel that killed Alexander Hamilton. Historian Nancy Eisenberg explains that Burr's oration merged pacifistic ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment with a prophetic militancy, Its theme was strikingly undemocratic. Men of action, the political elect, were divinely called and naturally gifted to lead society. These chosen men, Burr argued, nourished those hidden sparks of genius, so capable of enlightening the world. As enlightened prophets, they deserved a public stage, combining noble ambition with discretion. To avoid dishonor, they even concealed their natural defects from the scorn and ridicule of the less honorable part of mankind. The teenage Burr fully embraced Princeton's assumption that men of genius and action could become invincible. We don't know how actively Burr participated, but he was on campus as protests against British rule swept the 13 colonies. Princeton men staged public demonstrations, wore homespun cloth at graduation, and even burned Massachusetts Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson in effigy. That last act was part of the growing resistance to the East India Company, whose dumped tea on the American market had sparked outrage in a desperate attempt to recoup London's investment. By 1774, when militias were being organized, Princeton students walked off campus en masse to join the separatist movement. Burr and his best friend Matthias Ogden soon followed, heading to Boston to enlist in the Continental Army in 1775. Burr was inspired to enlist after hearing about the battles of Lexington and Concord, the classic entry point into the American Revolution. It makes sense as the spark that drove him to risk his life for his country. But the shot heard round the world is steeped in historical revisionism, erasing some of the revolution's key players. Take the first deaths of the conflict. History books often start there, but they overlook the men caught up in the Boston Massacre. A large crowd protesting taxation without representation and angry at British soldiers taking dock workers' jobs off duty confronted the Redcoats, some of whom had already been beaten by colonists the night before. Leading the crowd was Crispus Attucks. His story is remarkable. He escaped enslavement at 27 and spent the next 2 decades working on trade ships, often serving as a harpoonist on whaling hunts, the most dangerous and crucial job at sea. British records place Attucks front and center in the protests, club in hand. According to a fugitive slave ad, he stood 6'2", and one can imagine the life of a slave-turned-whaler left him as strong as he was tall. Attucks was the first man to die in the massacre, joined by 4 other Bostonians. Martin Luther King Jr. later called him one of the most influential figures in African American history. But maybe the hyphen isn't even necessary. By some measures, the former slave might be considered one of the most influential men in American history. Period. Few know of Crispus Attucks' central role in igniting the revolution. He was effectively erased from history by Paul Revere, the colonial hero ironically buried in the same cemetery as the man he denied a place in the story. Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre is the most famous depiction of the event. But look closely at the 5 victims and you won't see a single man of color in the crowd. Brown and black appear elsewhere, on coats, boots, even a dog, but not on the people who actually died. The History Channel notes the engraving's significance. The print is included in nearly every American history textbook and is indelibly linked with the events of the Boston Massacre. It lit a flame under the patriot cause and stoked anti-British sentiment throughout the restless colonies. And yet it was not an accurate portrayal of who was really there. But that's what propaganda is designed to do. Twist current events into a story meant to stir the audience to action. John Adams, our nation's future second president, ended up defending the British soldiers. awkwardly cementing Boston's racial bias in the historical record. He framed the Boston Massacre as an act of self-defense, describing Crispus Attucks as an enraged black man, a stranger leading a contingent of angry colonists towards the soldiers. Adams closed his argument by asserting that this is the behavior of Attucks, to whose mad behavior, in all probability, the dreadful carnage of that night is chiefly to be ascribed. Thus, the American Revolution began with Adams exonerating the soldiers, Revere fueling the revolt, and Attucks being ridden out of the tale. Revere shows up again at Lexington and Concord, warning that the British were coming, or more accurately, that the regulators were on the move. His warning gave time for the colonial militia to prepare. The Redcoats had left Boston to disarm the countryside and weren't ready for the firefight that forced a frantic retreat back to the sea. That clash would go on to inspire Aaron Burr to join the rebellion. Revere's ride was brave, no doubt, but it makes you wonder why every American schoolchild learns about him, and not Sybil Ludington, who rode twice the distance in 1777 to rally the troops. After her town of Danbury was sacked, 16-year-old Sybil jumped on a horse to warn the surrounding towns. Like Revere, her ride gave the militia time to organize and push back the British, but her journey was far more intense. She rode through the night, covered 3 times the distance, and had to dodge not just scattered British troops, but also a gang called the Skinners, who were taking advantage of the chaos to commit crimes, particularly assaults on young women. Her heroism was acknowledged at the time, even earning a handwritten thank you from George Washington. But history largely erased her story in favor of Revere's. We don't know how Burr, an enlightened thinker who championed both feminism and the abolition of slavery, felt about either hero, but it's easy to imagine he would have celebrated both of their sacrifices for the young republic. Burr was just 20 when he joined the fight against the British. That might sound young, but he was older than 18-year-olds James Madison and the Frenchman Marquis de Lafayette, and older than Andrew Jackson, who at 9 was already running dispatches for the army. Age didn't protect Jackson, though. When captured, he refused to shine a British soldier's shoes and took a hard blow to the face for his defiance. Burr was assigned to Benedict Arnold's regiment. The future traitor had already made a name for himself with a bold raid on the British fort in Quebec, stoking dreams of an offensive war. The Continental Congress soon authorized an invasion of British-held Canada under General Richard Montgomery, with Arnold's regiment sent to reinforce them and secure Quebec. Burr's education and famous family name made him stand out immediately among the 1,000 recruits signed up for the expedition. Eisenberg suggests he was likely included in a religious ceremony led by Arnold and several officers, who asked to visit the tomb of the British evangelist George Whitefield, a friend of Burr's father. When the coffin was open, little remained of the preacher, just dust and scraps of clothing. The officers proceeded to cut up Whitefield's collar and wristbands, dividing them up as relics. With these sacred pieces of cloth in hand, the officers turned the expedition into a quasi-religious crusade. They instinctively knew that they needed help from above. Historians compare the trek from Maine to Quebec to Hannibal's crossing of the Alps. The soldiers slogged through 350 miles of rough roads, tangled brambles, and climbs so steep that they were reduced to crawling on all fours. Ogden's journals note that by the end, his boots were so worn he had to wrap them in flour sacks just to keep his feet dry. A third of the men never finished the expedition. Many turned back and others succumbed to disease, their starving bodies giving out along the way. The route had been carefully chosen to hide the 1,000-man force from the British, allowing them to ambush the enemy while Montgomery's larger army drew their attention. Burr distinguished himself throughout the ordeal, prompting Arnold to send a letter of introduction to General Montgomery just outside Quebec City. Thanks to Burr's aristocratic birth and education, Montgomery immediately claimed him for his own staff, lamenting that the regiment lacked proper gentlemen of good birth. In Montgomery, Burr saw a living embodiment of the ideal citizen he had extolled in his sermon on honor. The general seemed almost invincible. As Eisenberg recounts, Montgomery knew how to carry himself. To his men, he had to appear fearless. He had nearly been killed 3 times during the invasion of Canada. In the siege of St. John's, while examining an artillery battery, a cannonball tore through his coat tail, threw him from the breastwork, and yet he landed on his feet, astonishing his men. He faced 2 other close calls in Quebec. His sled was destroyed by a cannonball just after he left it, and 7 days later a shell barely missed him while inspecting another battery. Montgomery's calm under fire only enhanced his reputation. Burr's awe was echoed in a letter that he wrote to Montgomery's wife, describing the general as an angel sent to us for a moment. Tragically, God reclaimed his angel at the Battle of Quebec, turning the siege into a nightmare. Montgomery joined 400 of his own men, with Arnold surviving 600, still 300 short against defenders behind the city's thick walls. Retreat would have been sensible, but most of Arnold's troops' enlistments expired the next day. Before that happened, Montgomery and his aide, Aaron Burr, threw themselves into a desperate assault, racing against time and fate, trying to snatch victory from the jaws of certain defeat. The assault began well, with a column of American troops advancing under a snowstorm and passing through 2 stockades without resistance. Then the British Canadians sprang their trap, mowing down the front of the column, including Montgomery. Eisenberg notes that what happened next is a matter of dispute. The most complete contemporary report claims that Burr led the troops as they reached the first stockade, and after the deadly blast that killed Montgomery and the others, stayed behind with 2 men to cover their retreat. None of the bodies were recovered. Another account, however, claims Burr tried to recover Montgomery's body. In 1807, a survivor told Senator William Plumer that Burr returned alone and attempted, amidst a shower of musket fire, to carry on his shoulder the body of Montgomery. But the general, being a large man, and Burr small, and the snow deep, prevented him. Years later, yet another soldier suggested Burr had actually been the first to call a retreat, an action that may have saved half the regiment from capture. The conflicting accounts matter because they would have mattered to Aaron Burr himself, a man desperate to build a reputation that could let him achieve the remarkable things he believed he had been saved for. Montgomery became the latest martyr of the Revolution, immortalized at center stage in John Trumbull's 1786 painting of the general's death. Burr is nowhere to be seen in the painting, despite the fact that everybody agreed he was nearby during the ambush. Adding insult to injury, his close friend Matthias Ogden occupies the spot Burr should have held. The only other notable absence? Benedict Arnold, who by the time the painting was commissioned had already betrayed the fledgling nation. Burr's own betrayal, however, was still 19 years to come. We don't have a clear answer for why Burr was passed over in favor of Ogden, but it would become a reoccurring theme in this phase of his life. Ogden was subsequently selected to join George Washington's staff, even after Burr accused his friend of having a fickle heart which enjoyed the caresses of the great and the flatteries of the low. Their letters hint at the deeper reason. Burr himself never applied for the post. As he wrote, "I have never made any application, and as you know me, you know I never shall." His lifelong focus on honor, the very concept he had refined at Princeton, demanded that a man curb his ambition, let others see him for what he truly was, and accept awards bestowed rather than trumpet his own glories. But that was never how the system actually worked. Burr wanted the rewards the system could offer, but refused to demean himself to get them. The events at Quebec changed the trajectory of both the war and Burr's life. Eisenberg notes that Montgomery's widow later expressed her opinion that Burr would well have risen faster and further serving under Montgomery, a general who possessed flair to rival Washington. Instead, Burr remained in the frozen North, ineffectively blockading Quebec. His war journal turns dark, describing himself as dirty, ragged, moneyless, and friendless, and accusing Congress of being either drunk or crazy for sending him north. Historian Alan Taylor writes that the siege of Quebec collapsed with the arrival of a Royal Navy squadron bearing 7,000 British troops. As the Patriots fled upstream, hundreds succumbed to smallpox. Losing faith in Congress, local inhabitants refused to sell produce to hungry patriots, who resorted to looting, further alienating the French Canadians. The chaotic retreat continued to Lake Champlain, with patriots abandoning Montreal and St. John. New commander General John Sullivan reported, "I found myself at the head of a dispirited army, filled with horror at the thought of seeing their enemy. Smallpox, famine, and disorder had rendered them almost lifeless." Half of his 7,000 men were too sick or wounded for duty. Lice and maggots were creeping in millions over the victims, one soldier noted. Only the British Army's painfully slow pursuit allowed the Patriots to escape. By early July, the wreckage of the Northern Army staggered into Ticonderoga, described by John Adams as disgraced, defeated, discontented, diseased, naked, undisciplined, and eaten up with vermin. Burr recovered in time to link with General Washington's forces in Greenwich Village. Already obsessed with being counted among the Revolution's great men, Burr would later purchase the very house Washington had used as his New York headquarters. Washington believed he could hold the city against the British. He was gravely mistaken. After 2 months of probing attacks, 30,000 professional British soldiers finally descended upon 20,000 untrained American volunteers. It took only half a day of fighting for the rout to begin, as the Patriots scattered in a desperate bid to escape the British war juggernaut. The Continental Army's escape from New York City unfolded under a cloak of sound and shadow. Dogs howled in panic at the wailing of Native American soldiers, masking the desperate retreat of the soldiers. Smoke curled from burning buildings, and the streets rang with the clash of panicked troops and the occasional crack of musket fire. Burr, drawing on his intimate knowledge of the city, guided units along safer routes, saving both men and pieces of artillery from capture. Yet the calamity of the retreat fueled critics like General Charles Lee, who quickly painted Washington as a commander incapable of living up to his reputation. Our nation's founding father himself privately admitted the grim truth. The army was a chaotic, frightened mass, troops firing in the dead of the night, men accidentally wounding one another. Every day a gamble against misfire and disorder. The retreat from New York transformed the revolution into a defensive struggle, with Washington repeatedly outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outnumbered. The British, confident but calculating, let him escape. One general remarking, "If a good bleeding can bring those Bible-faced Yankees to their senses, the fever of independence should soon abate." Their goal was psychological domination, not annihilation. Congress even dispatched John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Turlege to negotiate on Staten Island, but no agreement could be reached. Amid the chaos, Burr's role shifted. Initially added to Washington's staff, he soon transferred to General Israel Putnam's camp, hero of Bunker Hill and Washington's second-in-command. He sought action, not prestige. As Eisenberg notes, Burr simply wanted a more active role in the war. He wished to leave Washington's staff even before he met the general. Assigned to Putnam, Burr stood to exercise more influence. As Putnam's right-hand man, he would not have to compete for attention in the way he would have as one of several aides in Washington's large military family. In the maelstrom of New York, Burr's decisiveness and local knowledge meant the difference between chaos and survival, shaping his reputation as a man of both courage and cunning. Putnam's forces moved to Philadelphia, the de facto capital of the rebelling colonies, and the next obvious target for the British. Burr was put in charge of logistics for the city's defense, a role that forced him to obsess over the small details. It was here that his political philosophy of utilitarianism began to take shape, focusing on what would create the greatest good for the greatest number, rather than chasing grand utopian solutions. By the spring of 1777, Burr felt he had proven himself ready for independent command. 3 months later, Washington appointed him lieutenant colonel, attaching him to a regiment led by Colonel William Malcolm, a man who had essentially purchased his rank. For a man devoted to honor and meritocracy, the assignment was humiliating, especially when his friend Matthias Ogden had already achieved the full rank of colonel. Burr would later receive a brigadier general title, but for now his accomplishments seemed to be eclipsed by Ogden's meteoric rise. Ogden performed admirably throughout the war, even enduring capture and ransom at one point. Toward the end of the conflict, he devised a daring plan to kidnap the 16-year-old son of King George. Washington authorized it, but Ogden hesitated, heeding caution that success was unlikely. By every measure, Ogden's record shone. Yet for Burr, it was a bitter pill. Friends understand one another's faults and tend to be the most jealous regarding their successes. Publicly, Burr offered congratulations for each new commission. Privately, he simmered, convinced the honors should have been his. Of course, his strict code of honor prevented open complaint. In a letter to Washington, he thanked the general for his promotion, noting only that it had taken so long that he was serving beneath others who are younger than him, and quietly questioning whether it was due to some failing on his part. His new responsibility was to hold a vital artery of the Hudson River in New York's mountains. Isolated and under constant threat, Burr's outpost was a lonely frozen perch overlooked by history, even as its strategic importance was immense. Every decision, positioning troops, securing supply lines, monitoring enemy movement, rested on his judgment alone. Any failure could open the door to disaster for Washington's northern flank. Yet recognition never came. While Burr struggled with the bitter solitude of command, the British seized Ticonderoga, repelled raids on Staten Island, and battered Washington in Pennsylvania, a battle that left the newly arrived Marquis de Lafayette wounded. Burr's story has always lingered at the margins, a footnote in the Revolution's larger narrative. His skill and sacrifices largely invisible to the world. Burr proved himself the finest of his regiment, leading constant raids against the British while navigating a mutiny and the loss of 2 of the 5 forts in the region. When Putnam was relieved of command, Burr was folded into the rest of the Continental Army as it wintered in Valley Forge. The Pennsylvania village lived up to its name, transforming Washington's ragged army into a far more disciplined fighting force. But it was located only 18 miles from Philadelphia. The ongoing British occupation forced the Patriots to suffer through one of the harshest winters on record, with the British hoping starvation and disease would force the Americans to surrender. Historian Alan Taylor writes that 2,000 men, a fifth of the army, perished that winter from a debilitating combination of filth, exposure, malnutrition, and disease. While Washington grew closer to his suffering soldiers, he felt more distant from the civilians they defended. He rebuked Pennsylvania's legislatures for criticizing rather than supplying his army. He blamed the army's plight on prosperous and selfish citizens who pursued profit instead of sacrifice. He had troops whipped and even shoot civilians caught conveying provisions to Philadelphia, leaving their bodies beside the road as a warning to others. Such grim realities are often glossed over in patriotic retellings. Yet Valley Forge was also a crucible. Under the relentless discipline of Marquis de Lafayette and Prussian Baron von Steuben, Washington's soldiers became an elite force. Burr's assignment was to oversee the Gulf, the first line of defense should the British advance, a position of immense responsibility. It marked him as indispensable to the commanders of the war. Yet the lack of actual combat once again denied the hungry lieutenant colonel the chance to prove himself in battle, to earn recognition through merit rather than mere survival. The memoirs of Aaron Burr recount one particularly dramatic story from his time at Valley Forge. Eisenberg summarizes it, noting that his supposedly authoritative biographer, Matthew Davis, paints him as a rigid taskmaster. In one vignette, Burr single-handedly puts down a mutiny at the Gulf, a post just a few miles from Valley Forge. In this episode, Burr learns that the leaders of the mutiny plan to kill him in response to his rigid system of policing, drilling, and discipline. Emptying their muskets of cartridges, Burr cleverly thwarts the plot. The ringleader levels his gun at Burr and orders his comrades to shoot. At that instant, Burr draws his sword and smites the mutineer above the elbow. Like the story of him heroically returning through a blizzard to carry General Montgomery's body under fire, this tale is another example of Burr, or those shaping his legend, sensationalizing his service. After all, severing a soldier's arm and avoiding at least a slap on the wrist from superiors seems just a tad bit improbable. The odds are he did stop one or more mutinous soldiers, but without the cinematic flair needed to enter the historical record. Yet men have a way of believing their own legends, creating a persona that demands credit for feats that may never have occurred. When recognition doesn't come, the blame attaches to others. Men like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, who in Burr's eyes must have conspired to keep an ambitious orphan from rising above his station. The American victory at Saratoga brought France into the war. Seeking revenge for the loss of Canada in the French and Indian War, King Louis XVI plunged his nation into debt, setting the stage for the French Revolution and the eventual downfall of his family line. Burr, however, missed all of the fighting at Saratoga. Instead, he was assigned to guard the Hudson River. When French forces arrived as Washington's army emerged from its winter encampment, they split the British focus, allowing the Continental Army to begin winning battles of its own. The British abandoned Philadelphia, retreating to New York under harassment from Washington's forces, with the decisive clash coming at Monmouth, a battle later immortalized in the song "Stay Alive." But neither staying alive nor victory was far from assured. General Charles Lee and others preached caution, fearing another American disaster that could trigger mass desertions. Burr is noticeably absent from the song, marking one of the earliest points where his path would intersect with Alexander Hamilton. The lyrics depict a tense back and forth. Washington presses for an attack. Lee repeatedly counters with cries to retreat. Hamilton seethes at being left behind to organize logistics while Lee commands the assault. Burr, meanwhile, was given direct command of troops in the attack, proving himself on the front lines even as the drama of personalities played out around him. The Journal of the American Revolution reveals that Burr was at the head of Malcolm's regiment when General Charles Lee opened the battle. Burr was pushing his soldiers towards British lines when orders from Washington checked the advance. While his men held their line under intense British fire and in heat that soared to 96 degrees, Burr's horse was shot from under him, and he suffered what was probably a severe case of heat exhaustion. Burr returned to duty after the battle, but suffered severe nausea and headaches, probably the effects of his untreated heat stroke. In the aftermath of the battle, General Lee famously faced a court-martial for disobeying orders and insubordination to Washington. Burr wrote to the court and defended Lee. For Burr, the battle proved his bravery as a commander, damaged his health, and confirmed his opposition to Washington. It also marked the end of Burr's direct involvement with the main players in America's fight for independence. Burr respected Lee and shared his cautious judgment at Monmouth, but he remained steadfast in his notions of honor, objecting to Washington's aides, particularly Hamilton and John Laurens, who spread gossip that had tarnished Lee's reputation. In the clash of two dominant personalities, Burr made a fatal error. He chose the wrong side. Eisenberg notes, Lee was not an easy man to like. In his letter thanking Burr for his support at the trial, he included a slur on Washington, suggesting that America's great George Washington was in fact nothing more than a farmer. Reeling from the lingering effects of heat stroke, Burr was dispatched to West Point, where he stepped into the storm of military justice, presiding over a series of court-martials with a ruthless precision. He seized the moment to impose order, drafting a strict proclamation that outlawed the common practice of getting young men drunk to trick them into enlisting, a bold assertion of discipline in an army often defined by chaos. Only after partially regaining his strength was he transferred to Westchester County under General McDougall, where the relentless pressures of war awaited him once again. Eisenberg sets the stage for us, writing, "Since the fall of 1776, Westchester had been a major theater of war. It was one of the worst areas for civilians, a no man's land between two major armies. War had crushed the spirit of its inhabitants. Constant, unnerving activities made normal life impossible. Soldiers marched through towns, trampled fields, burned buildings, while marauding parties from both sides plundered the people without regard to their political allegiance. Loyalist troops known as the Queen's Rangers made regular incursions, captured Whigs, pillaged houses, and depleted families of food and livestock. The Whig Skinners were just as ruthless as Loyalist Rangers or cowboys. Both were motivated more by greed than a desire to win the war. The Skinners routinely used physical intimidation and violence to extort hidden treasures from frightened families. As one historian aptly described these wartime bandits, they skinned their victims first and asked about their political affiliation later. Many of the region's generals had deemed Westchester too dangerous, a land teetering on the edge of chaos. But Burr refused to be cowed. Honor demands it, he proclaimed to his superiors, and threw himself into the impossible task of restoring order. Within weeks, he had orchestrated a census, mapped the geography, and asserted control over the flow of information. Every detail mattered. He even ordered that all prostitutes traveling through the region be brought in for inspection, a stark assertion of authority in a lawless land. Yet despite his successes, Burr's time in Westchester lasted barely 3 months. Amid relentless pressure of duty, he embarked on a perilous personal journey, a secret affair with Theodosia Prevost, the married wife of a British officer stationed far in the south. Each 7-hour trek through enemy territory to meet her was a gamble with death, one that must have weighed heavily as he prepared his resignation. When he finally wrote to General Washington, Burr framed his departure with meticulous pride. The region was, quote, now protected from internal enemies, plunder suppressed, a civil government, though still fragile, gaining respect, sufficient forage secured, and a list of friends and foes, designated by character and history compiled. He assured the general that his system would function without him, that the evils which still appear to exist will be removed by the mechanical operation of plans already put in place. Exiting the theater of war, Burr left Westchester ordered and disciplined. And with that, Burr stepped away from the war, but not without claiming his spoils. He quietly acquired vast tracts of land at rock-bottom prices from the very people he had been charged to protect. It was a bold, audacious move, the first of many that would blur the lines between honor and ambition, abandoning the army in the midst of struggle, speculating with ruthless calculation, and pursuing a married woman. Each decision left a shadow over his name, a warning that Aaron Burr was a man whose ambition could never be fully contained. Next, we trace his rise through the political arena, a path that would take him to the vice presidency and into history's most infamous controversies. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com. or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.